On the balmy night of April 16, 1863, the prominent citizens and ranking officers in Vicksburg gather at the handsome townhouse of Major William O. Watts for the highly publicized gala. Once all the guests arrive, they eat, talk, and dance deep into the spring night. But just as the time nears 11 p.m., a single explosion is heard off towards the river, and soon a cacophony of blasts follows, startling all those in attendance. Seeing the western sky light up, men and women stop what they are doing and hurriedly make their way towards the bluff overlooking the Mississippi. Once they arrive, they look over the edge in astonishment, for down below in the river, they see a flotilla of the dreaded Federal ironclads blasting away as they sail past rebel guns. Just like the other Federal forces who have faced disaster in the last month of 1862, Major General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee is despondent after being repulsed not once, but twice in their attempt to get at Vicksburg. At the beginning of December, Grant attempted to march overland along the Mississippi Central Railroad, but his supply depot was burned to the ground during an audacious raid by Major General Earl Van Dorn. Unable to subsist in the dead of winter, Grant was obliged to retreat back to Union territory. At the same time, Grant's other prong was violently repulsed when Sherman's riverborne attack was defeated at Chickasaw Bayou. Realizing that an overland route from above the town is not going to yield results, Grant starts eyeing other, more creative approaches to reach the stubborn river citadel. With Rear Admiral David D. Porter's Brownwater Navy controlling the Mississippi north of Vicksburg, Grant decides to pivot his forces to the river and search for alternative routes to either flank the town or outright bypass it altogether. A major reason Grant decides to move his forces to the banks of the Mississippi is due to his harmonious relationship with Porter. Porter, unlike the other officers in the Navy, is fully willing to work with Grant to see this operation through. This is in stark contrast to how the two branches normally treat each other, as both the Army and Navy are usually at each other's throats. Thus, in mid-January, Grant starts shifting the majority of his corps to camps along the Mississippi. Major General Stephen A. Hurlbut, commanding the 16th Corps, is left behind in Memphis to guard against any rebel attack. Brigadier General James B. McPherson, commanding the 17th Corps, is ordered to Milliken's Bend in Louisiana. Finally, Major Generals John A. McClernand and William T. Sherman, in command of the 13th and 15th Corps, respectively, are ordered, following their capture of Arkansas Post, to the DeSoto Peninsula. The DeSoto Peninsula is a 3-mile-long tongue on the Louisiana shoreline that created a horseshoe-shaped bend in the river. With Vicksburg sitting atop the bluffs overlooking the river, it commands all the traffic traveling around the bend. Here, Grant hopes the two corps will finish Williams Canal, a pet project of Lincoln's that will allow river traffic to bypass the annoying fortress. Despite both seeing how pointless the operation really is, McClernand and Sherman have their orders to deepen and widen the canal. Grudgingly, the soldiers who have come here to fire are now in a ditch digging away. Luckily, they receive assistance from both impressed slave gangs from the local plantations and freemen who are looking for protection. Over 5,000 people, mostly Federal soldiers, are in the mud hacking, digging, and slogging away at the bottom of the canal. When not covered in the mud digging, the men find life hard, with chilly winds and incessant rain making the place unbearable. With only a 10-foot high levee to pitch their tents on, the men have little room to move around freely unless they want to find themselves covered in mud. Writing about his time on the levee, B.F. Stevenson said, "It has rained almost incessantly since we pitched our tents, and we can't walk from tent to tent without carrying along with us 10 pounds of mud." Not surprisingly, once the Federal forces set up shop on the banks of the Mississippi, disease incapacitates thousands. With no fresh water to drink, no room to spread out atop the levees, and no place to relieve themselves properly, disease strike Grant's forces a severe blow that not even the Confederates across the river could ever imagine. Surgeon Seneca Thrall alarmingly writes, "Many are dying and thousands more will if they stay here 2 months." Anticipating the medical crisis, Grant had ordered the construction of a massive hospital in Memphis that housed those rendered unfit for duty. However, even those sites quickly fill up, forcing surgeons to commandeer other, less sanitary places to house the infirm. At the end of January, Grant finally disembarks from his command ship to inspect his lieutenant's work. Sherman and McClernand's men managed to widen the canal to 60 feet and deepen it by 5 feet, enough to fit the desired traffic. Yet, regardless of their efforts, the river refuses to cooperate and continues to run along its main course. To make matters worse, even if the Federals managed to get the canal to work, both Grant and Sherman realized that the Confederates would simply reposition their guns farther south, enabling them to annihilate whoever decides to risk the journey. Seeing that their efforts are virtually in vain, Grant decides to press on, as any admission of defeat would look bad to those in Washington. Seeing that Williams Canal is proving fruitless, Grant starts eyeing up other locations to exert his effort. Realizing his best chance of taking Vicksburg is by attacking its flanks, Grant sends his topographical engineer, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Wilson, to reconnoiter the Mississippi Delta for any possible routes. Yet, when he returns from his mission, his report is not encouraging, stating, "The terrain is all marsh, heavily timbered, cut up with bayous and much overflowed. Without roads or bridges, this country with its unfordable watercourses, even if undefended, could hardly be traversed by any army with its impedimenta." With the northern flanks of Vicksburg seemingly unappealing for an advance, Grant and his staff start discussing a possible southern route instead. However, before a single Federal soldier could be ferried across below the town, Porter's Brownwater Navy would have to get past the imposing Vicksburg batteries. The largest concern for the possible operation is getting past the guns, as even the less menacing batteries at Fort Donelson the previous year proved extremely troubling for the ironclads. Regardless, Wilson argues that Porter's flotilla could run the batteries under the cover of darkness. But given the country's current disheartened state, Grant cannot risk such a hazardous venture. Though running the batteries sound tempting, Grant has to wait for better weather to come in the spring, as northeast Louisiana is inundated with water during the winter months. Until then, on January 30th, Grant sets in motion 2 other operations in the hopes of finding alternative routes. The first is to connect Lake Providence with the Red River by linking the canal to many of its tributaries in northern Louisiana. If this route works, Grant can link up with Banks and siege out Port Hudson together. The second is to break into the Yazoo River Delta by blowing up the levee at the Yazoo Pass opposite the Arkansas town of Helena. Though Wilson regards the Yazoo wilderness as impenetrable, a combined Army-Navy expedition could slice its way through the various rivers to a point that the Federals could easily outflank the Vicksburg garrison. That same day, Grant sends Wilson up to Helena with a 500-man detail to blow the giant levee separating the Mississippi River from the Yazoo Delta. 5 days later, on February 3rd, Wilson's detail blows up an enormous mine they buried underneath. Immediately following the explosion, water from the river floods in, which Wilson compares to the rushing waters of Niagara Falls. After waiting a week for the waters to subside, Wilson sends in his men to clear a path through the destroyed trees to make it accessible for an expedition. Soon, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, commander of the Confederate forces in Mississippi, receives word of the levee's destruction, but does little as he believes the pass is inaccessible. At the same time, Grant sends McPherson to construct the canal at Lake Providence. Once McPherson arrives, he gets his men, along with freemen, to work digging the canal. Yet, as they begin, they realize how arduous their task really is. Not only do they have to dig a ditch deep enough to allow transports to pass, but they also have to clear all the stumps and snags, objects that can easily tear great holes in the ship's bottom. Due to this backbreaking job, many of the Federal soldiers would rather play around than work, unlike their African counterparts, prompting Illinois surgeon Charles B. Tompkins to write, "They work with a will. The soldiers, who are detailed daily, do nothing but throw mud at the Negroes or at each other." Though the thought of reaching Port Hudson via the Red River sounds alluring, once Grant and McPherson reconnoiter the route they plan to take, they realize the task would take months to complete. To make matters worse, they also realize that once they are deep in enemy country, the rebels could easily line the path with sharpshooters to pick off their men. Seeing the challenges lying ahead with continuing the Lake Providence Canal, Grant's enthusiasm for the waterway diminishes greatly. Instead, Grant decides to pivot the majority of his attention to the Yazoo Pass, seeing greater opportunity there. Writing the Halleck, Grant said, "There is little possibility of getting through Lake Providence and Bayou Macon with an artificial channel. The Yazoo Pass expedition is a much greater success." On February 24th, with the Yazoo Pass now accessible, Grant orders an expedition to sail down the delta to get at Vicksburg's rear. Leading the naval component of this expedition is Lieutenant Commander Watson Smith with 11 gunboats, 2 of which are the ironclads Baron de Kalb and Chillicothe, while Brigadier General Leonard F. Ross leads the Army component, roughly 6,000 men from 9 regiments. With Pemberton unconcerned about the Yazoo Pass, the Federal expedition has a great opportunity to force a lodgment behind Vicksburg's defenses without facing much resistance. However, Smith, who joins the expedition sick, does not help their efforts to get the jump on the rebels. Instead of moving as fast as possible, Smith moves at a snail's pace, only traveling during the day and stopping for lunch, much to Ross's chagrin. When Pemberton receives alarming reports of the so-called Abolition Fleet entering the Coldwater River, he moves with urgency to stop them. To do this, he sends out Major General William W. Loring, a pugnacious, one-armed officer, to arrest their approach. With a force of 2,000, Loring sets his men to work placing obstacles and building fortifications. In the river, the Confederates sink the famous steamer, the Star of the West, that blocked the fleet's approach. While on land, along the long neck between the Tallahatchie and Yazoo rivers, they emplace pieces of various calibers behind a defensive work, which consists of dirt-covered cotton bales piled 10 feet high. Once they are finished, they christen their fortification as Fort Pemberton. Finally, on March 11th, the Federal expedition arrives within sight of the rebel blockade. Smith sends in his 2 ironclads to blast away at the Confederate fortifications. However, with only a narrow, straightforward path to the front, the ironclads present splendid targets for the rebel gunners. Seeing the boats get pounded, Ross tries to help by organizing an attack, but the boggy ground near the fort is unable to support an infantry assault. Thus, in 3 different attempts, Smith's 2 ironclads are riddled with shot and shell, with the Chillicothe taking the brunt of the fire. With ammunition running low and scared of being trapped, the Federals decide to retire on March 18th. Yet, the tired Federals are not able to get far, as they encounter reinforcements sent by Grant under the command of Brigadier General Isaac F. Quimby. Quimby, who outranks Ross, takes over the Army component and orders the expedition to renew the offensive. But as they once again near the rebel fortifications, neither Quimby nor any of the boat captains dare to challenge the Confederate defenses. Unsure of what to do, the Federal force stays where it's at until Quimby receives orders from Grant to withdraw. Luckily for the Federals, the rebels fail to pursue as they slowly make their way back to the Mississippi. Once again, Grant has failed to find a way around Vicksburg's defenses. While Loring is bludgeoning Smith's flotilla, Grant has not received any word of the status of the expedition. Fearing for the worst, Grant and Porter start forming a naval relief force to save the floundering fleet. Just then, a Freeman informs Porter of a hidden tributary called Steele's Bayou, which feeds into the Yazoo River. Better yet, this bayou can give Porter a clear avenue to threaten the Confederate naval base at Yazoo City, a move that would force Loring to give up his position at Fort Pemberton and save Smith's riddled fleet. Seeing no better option, Porter decides to give it a try and orders up 5 of his prized ironclads and 4 mortar boats. On March 14th, Porter sends his relief fleet into the secret waters. For the first half of the trip, it is pretty easy going, but the deeper Porter's flotilla goes, the harder it gets. Reporter Frank Wilkie, accompanying the flotilla, writes, "The bayou grew narrower and crooked, till it resembled more the course taken by some erratic meadow brook." Also seeing the potential of such a path, Grant sends Sherman with an infantry force to accompany Porter. If the expedition succeeds in taking Yazoo City, Grant would have an excellent base to attack Vicksburg from the rear. Once Porter reaches Deer Creek, the terrain becomes even more difficult as the bayous and creeks narrow, barely letting a single boat pass at a time. When the boats do pass through, they knock down dead branches, which drop vermin of all types upon the decks. Armed with brooms, the soldiers and sailors sweep rats, mice, snakes, and other pests into the muddy water down below. On March 19th, Porter nears a juncture of Rolling Fork and Deer Creek, but stops as reports of the rebels in placing artillery arrive. Unable to press forward without infantry support, Porter calls on Sherman, but the red-haired general is unable to reach him in a timely manner, thus informing the anxious admiral that he'll have to survive on his own for the time being. The next day, seeing the Federal fleet stuck in the creek, the Confederates dispatch a force to harass them. The rebels mount a few attacks to capture the trapped ironclads, but each one fails to get close. Unable to capture them by hand, the rebels set up sharpshooters in the trees to pick off the Federal sailors. Realizing how perilous his position is, Porter calls off the advance and orders a retreat back down the creek. On the 21st, Porter receives even more bad news. Another escaped slave informs the admiral that the rebels have gone into his rear and are cutting down trees to block them in. Fearing for the worst, Porter orders all his captains to prepare for enemy boarders. Mud is smeared along the sides to make the holes slippery. Grape is loaded, hatches are covered, men are ordered to sleep with their arms, and if all else fails, the ships are prepared to be blown up. If this worst case scenario happens, the men are ordered to abandon ship, assemble into groups, and make their way back to Steele's Bayou. Porter expects few to survive. But, just as they finish their final touches, more freedmen arrive, declaring to the Yankees, "Yo folks is coming." Arriving on the scene is the 8th Missouri, a regiment formed by riverboat workers before the war. Though this force is not big enough to secure their position, it is just enough to give Porter some breathing room. The next day, March 22nd, the Missourians and sailors work together to clear the path, allowing the trapped ironclads to slowly back out. During the movement, Porter is shot at while watching his men work and is nearly killed. Luckily, Sherman arrives with the rest of his force to drive off the rebel harassers. Once the rebels are gone and the trees removed, Porter begins his trip back to the Mississippi. While he sails back, he liberates as many slaves as possible. Writing to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, he says, "More than any place I have seen, do slaves seem determined to be free. I do not blame them, for slavery exists in the worst forms in the valley of the Mississippi." 5 days later, on March 27th, the members of the expedition safely returned to Young's Point. Though the expedition proved fruitless, the Federals luckily suffered few casualties, with only 3 killed. Despite their successful evacuation, this is Grant's 4th failed attempt at getting around Vicksburg's defenses. Grant is beginning to run out of options to flank the impregnable river fortress. Not only is he running out of options, but Grant is fully aware that the administration is losing their patience with his pointless operations. Both Grant and Halleck desire Grant to strike a blow against the rebel stronghold and not continue his random escapades. While Porter is deep in the Mississippi Delta, his foster brother, Rear Admiral David D. Farragut, arrives just south of Vicksburg with a few ships after running the batteries at Port Hudson. Farragut intends to hold the river between the 2 rebel bastions, but needs more ships as a majority of his boats were smashed during his daring run. Farragut calls for support and receives a response from Brigadier General Alfred W. Ellett, the commander of the Mississippi Marine Brigade, who promises his family's rams. But before they can join Farragut, they have to run the gauntlet of fire that is the Vicksburg batteries. On March 25th, in an excess of zeal, the Ellett family prematurely runs 2 rams through the Vicksburg gauntlet in broad daylight. With a clear line of sight, the rebel batteries atop the bluffs pummel the 2 ships, with only 1 ship, the Switzerland, making it through. When Porter learns of this exploit, he banishes the uncontrollable Elletts. Farragut manages to calm down his brother and turn his attention to operations down south. Once the ram is fixed up, Farragut sails down to the Red River and blockades it, shutting off from rebel traffic, marking the first victory Grant has had since Sherman's bloody repulse at Chickasaw Bayou. Best of all, with Farragut's arrival, the admiral has shifted both Grant's and Porter's attention to the south side of Vicksburg, the direction both want to go. In late March, tension begins to build in the Army headquarters as all the failures compound. With thousands of his men succumbing to diseases, his massive projects failing to divert the Mississippi, and his expeditions repulsed at every approach, Grant realizes that if he cannot find a secure route to Vicksburg soon, he'll probably soon join the disgraced ranks of all those who have failed before him. Though Lincoln has been a steadfast supporter of Grant since Shiloh, the constant news of his failed expeditions begin to wear down the president. Telling a reporter of all Grant's goose chases, Lincoln critically said, "If the rebels can blockade us on the Mississippi, which is a mile wide, they can certainly stop us on the little streams not much wider than our gunboats and shut us up so we can't get back again." Halleck, likewise, is not much happier with the general's progress. Scolding Grant, the general-in-chief said, "These eccentric operations may have been very proper for the purpose of reconnoitering the country, but it is very important that, when you strike any blow, you should have your troops sufficiently concentrated to make that blow effective." Not surprisingly, a lot of this overarching scrutiny is being fed by the officers and men in Grant's army. McClernand, who desires Grant's position, has forwarded the president multiple letters claiming the general has been seen intoxicated on many occasions. Though Grant has been known to drink quite a lot, all the accusations seem to be quite similar in their content. Despite the rumors, when a group of senators confront Lincoln about Grant's heavy drinking, the president responds by saying, "I wish some of you would tell me the brand of whiskey that Grant drinks. I would like to send a barrel of it to my other generals." To ensure no more claims of insobriety surface, Grant's chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel John A. Rawlins, makes a general pledge that he will not touch any more liquor for the remainder of the war. Another beckoning critic of Grant's Bayou operations is Major General Cadwallader C. Washburn. Regardless of how long Washburn has been with Grant, the failures are demoralizing him as well. Writing to his brother, Illinois Representative Elihu B. Washburn, the general said, "The truth is Grant has no plan for taking Vicksburg, and is frittering away time and strength to no purpose. The truth must be told even when it hurts. You cannot make a silk purse out of a sow's ear." When Washburn receives worrying news that Grant is now considering an all-out assault against Haynes' Bluff, near Chickasaw Bayou, Washburn employs his brother to intervene. Lincoln, alarmed by Grant's spiraling situation, secretly dispatches Charles A. Dana, the acting Assistant Secretary of War, to be the eyes and ears of the administration in the federal camp. Lincoln intends to use Dana to assess Grant and determine if the general needs to be replaced. This is being done through the pretense of Dana arriving to investigate the paymasters in the Army of the Tennessee, using Grant's constant complaints of his men either not getting paid or being paid late. However, despite the hope that Dana keeps his true objective a secret, Grant and his men easily discover his true purpose for being there. On April 6, Dana arrives at Young's Point to meet with Grant. Seeing Dana as the best way to stay in Lincoln's good graces, Grant decides to bring Dana into his confidence. Soon, Dana finds himself close to the Army commander, with dinner shared, stories exchanged, and tents placed nearby. As he gets to know Grant's inner circle, he reports his finding of the Stanton. "Sherman," he wrote, "greatly impressed me as a man of genius and of the widest intellectual acquisitions." While the Army chief, he said, "Grant is self-effacing and deeply honest with a temper that nothing can disturb, and a judgment that is judicial in its comprehensiveness and wisdom. Not a great man, except morally, not an original or brilliant man, but sincere, thoughtful, deep." Around the same time Dana arrives, Grant finally receives news of a long-awaited breakthrough. The Army commander gets word that the land south of Young's Point has started to see its floodwaters recede. With a new avenue opening up to flank Vicksburg, Grant takes one more look at Haynes' Bluff, which he finally deems suicidal. With all his options of forced lodgment north of the city now exhausted, Grant turns his full attention to getting at Vicksburg from below. Grant intends to have his men march downriver to the small town of New Carthage. From there, they'll be ferried across the Mississippi, landing at a point that has good access to roads. Yet, the biggest factor is getting ships past the Vicksburg guns. Luckily, Porter, who's already looking to get downriver to support Farragut, readily agrees to the plan. On April 8th, with Porter's cooperation secured, Grant presents his plan to subordinates, who show signs of opposition. Sherman, the main critic, argues that even if the boats miraculously survive running the Vicksburg gauntlet, how would the army be able to survive in the fatal trap of southern Mississippi, cut off from reinforcements, communication, and supplies? Seeing only trouble, Sherman counters Grant by proposing the overland route once again, but this falls on deaf ears. Grant did not present his plan to his officers to debate it. Seething, Sherman proudly complains to his wife, "My own opinion is that this whole plan of attack on Vicksburg will fail, must fail, and the fault will be on us all. Of course, but Grant will be the front. His recall leaves McClernand next. I could simply get a leave and stay away. I will not serve under McClernand." Despite his private rantings, Sherman eventually cools down and dutifully agrees to work with his friend to accomplish their goal. With all of his officers finally in compliance, Grant begins preparing his army to cross the mighty Mississippi. First, the general starts ordering all his units to their staging ground. McClernand, though continually intriguing behind Grant's back, is selected to lead the column south, with Sherman and then McPherson pulling up the rear. As McClernand's 13th Corps marches, they find the route not as dry as they had hoped, making the progress agonizingly slow. Men struggle in knee-deep mud, artillery pieces sink to their hubs, and the gray-clad mosquitoes attack the ranks incessantly. While the Federal soldiers march south, they build corridor roads to make the passage easier. Once the Federal force reaches New Carthage, they find the town completely submerged, with only the roofs above water. With New Carthage unsuitable for a staging area, the troops press on farther south. Soon, they come upon Ione, with its riverside dock and open terrain, an ideal location for a forward base. As McClernand's 13th Corps files into Ione, Brigadier General John S. Bowen, the Confederate commander of Grand Gulf, Mississippi, anxiously watches as the Federal forces across the river grow in strength. Wanting to impede their advance as much as possible, Bowen dispatches Colonel Francis Cockrell's Missouri Brigade across the river to harass McClernand. At the same time, Bowen reports his findings of Pemberton, but the general dismisses him as he also gets reports of Federal steamers moving north. Pemberton, believing the movement of the steamers as a definite sign of a retreat, wires Davis, "I think most of Grant's forces are being withdrawn to Memphis." Feeling secure with Grant apparently withdrawing, Pemberton agrees to send Major General Earl Van Dorn and 6,000 troopers to Bragg. This is due to Bragg believing that Rosecrans is on the verge of attacking in Tennessee. However, on April 15th, Pemberton realizes his mistake when he receives additional reports of Federal steamers chock full of men moving south near Lake Providence. Assuming they are bound for Vicksburg, Pemberton wires his subordinates to warn them of an upcoming attack. Unbeknownst to the Confederates, the Federals are not preparing to attack Vicksburg. They are preparing to run past it. For Grant to get his army across the Mississippi, he'll need ships south of Vicksburg, and that is what Porter is setting out to do. In total, Porter is looking to run the gauntlet with 12 ships, which consists of 7 ironclads, 3 civilian steamers, a small tug, and a ram. To give his ships as much success as possible, Porter plans to run the guns at night. Even with that, Porter reinforces his ships with coal barges, cotton bales, and sacks of grain. The guns Porter is looking to run are nothing to scoff at. Among the arsenal defending the shoreline are 37 pieces of anti-ship ordnance with another dozen or so smaller field pieces. These are similar pieces that have successfully defended other parts of the Confederacy, like at Fort Donelson and Drewry's Bluff. Most of these guns sit behind earthen parapets roughly 30 to 40 feet above the waterline. Though these parapets defend the gunners from counterfire, they are unable to press their guns low enough if any ship desires to get near the shoreline. Though both Grant and Porter are expecting massive casualties, Porter knows it can be done. In February of 1862, Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote ran past Island No. 10 in the dead of night. The next month, in April, his foster brother ran the guns of Forts Jackson and St. Philip, and again recently past Port Hudson, though with lesser success. Last month, the Elliots managed to get one of their 2 rams past Vicksburg in broad daylight. With all that, Porter believes he can do it in the dead of night. Best of all, neither the Vicksburg garrison nor its townfolk is aware of Federal plans. A rebel spy embedded in Grant's army sent a warning of Porter's upcoming run, but the message was never received. To make things worse, all eyes in Vicksburg will be on the gala hosted that very night, and all the officers of the river batteries are expected to attend. On the afternoon of April 16th, while the prominent citizens of Vicksburg begin arriving at the gala, Porter pens one last message before shoving off. By the grace of God, I hope to see us yet with Uncle Abe's foot on Jeff Davis's neck. Once Porter sends off his message, he leads a column of ships towards Vicksburg. Waiting to watch the spectacle at Young's Point are dozens of officers and their guests, including Grant and his family. All are there hoping to experience one of the grandest sights of the war. As the spectators wine and dine, Porter's quiet calm slowly descends into the darkness towards the daunting town of Vicksburg. Just before 11 o'clock, Porter's quiet metal beats are spotted in the river. Suddenly, the entire rebel shoreline erupts into flame, lighting up the starry night sky. Nurse Annie Wittemeyer, a guest of the Grants, said, "The bluffs were ablaze with cannon fire. Thunderclaps tear the sky to pieces above our heads." Stirred by the noise, the soldiers and citizens rushed to the bluffs and to other high points to watch the fight. Looking to avoid as much fire as possible, Porter guides the column to within pistol shot of the shoreline. Here, the Federal sailors return as much as they get, ripping into the Confederate artillerists. But due to the closeness, the artillerists cannot depress their guns low enough. Only a few manage to land a shot, and even fewer do any real damage. Surprisingly, it is the rebel infantrymen along the shoreline who inflict casualties. Just after an hour of incessant firing, the guns fall silent. The Northern spectators believe the entire fleet is destroyed. Julia Grant leans over to Annie and whispers, "Our men are all dead men. No one can live in such a rain of fire and live." Grant, who's risking his career on this venture, is too anxious to wait for tomorrow to hear the news. Instead, he grabs his horse and rides south to see for himself the outcome of Porter's run. Riding along the corridor roads, Grant arrives at Ione and discovers the fleet still intact. Not only did Porter's boats suffer minimal damage, with only 1 transport lost, but only 12 men out of the 2,000 brave souls were casualties. With the success of Porter's run, Vicksburg's military value on the Mississippi essentially disappears. With a sizable Federal flotilla now patrolling the gap between the 2 rebel bastions, the connection between the eastern and western portions of the Confederacy is effectively severed. No longer can men and supplies be easily transported across the Mississippi. Now that Grant has ships in the Confederate Wedge, he can start looking forward to the next phase of the campaign. With Porter's force now in complete control of the waters, Grant can land his forces wherever he likes. Realizing the significance of Porter's run, Grant tells Dana, "Vicksburg's fate is sealed. A campaign that has known nothing but disappointment now cannot fail."